The morning mist clung to the terraced hillsides of Shimane Prefecture as 12-year-old Akiko Watanabe pressed her face against the cold window of her family's farmhouse. October 15, 1945, just 2 months after Japan's surrender, and the world her grandmother had described in whispered warnings seemed to be materializing before her eyes. Down the winding mountain path that led to their isolated village of Tsubaki, a convoy of olive-green American military vehicles was climbing steadily upward, their engines growling like mechanical beasts in the pre-dawn silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would challenge everything 3 generations of the Watanabe family believed about their new American occupiers, transforming fear into something far more complicated and ultimately more profound. The story that unfolded in this remote mountain community over the following days would become a testament to how the simplest human gestures can shatter the most carefully constructed walls of prejudice and misunderstanding. Akiko's grandmother, 73-year-old Sachiko Watanabe, had spent weeks preparing the family for this moment. The Americans would come, she had warned, and when they did, they would take what they wanted. Food would be confiscated, young women would need to hide, and the brutal occupation that Japanese propaganda had promised would begin in earnest. These foreign devils, as the wartime broadcasts had called them, possessed neither honor nor mercy. They were savages who delighted in the suffering of the conquered, particularly the weak and defenseless. The village of Tsubaki, nestled in a valley so remote that even the wartime rationing had barely touched its rice stores, had become a refuge for families fleeing the devastated cities. Akiko's own family had swelled from their original household of 5 to include her uncle Hiroshi's widow and 3 children, evacuated from bombed-out Kobe, plus her cousin Kenji, a former Imperial Navy sailor who had managed to make his way home after his destroyer was sunk near the Philippines. 15 people now crowded into the traditional farmhouse that had sheltered the Watanabe family for over 2 centuries. The approaching convoy represented everything they had been taught to fear. American soldiers, the very embodiment of Western aggression and cultural destruction, were about to enter their sanctuary. Kenji, still bearing the psychological scars of his naval service, had spent the previous evening sharing increasingly dark predictions about what would unfold. He had heard stories from other veterans, tales of American brutality that seemed to confirm the worst propaganda claims. The occupiers would strip the village of its remaining food supplies, he insisted. They would requisition homes for their own use, forcing families into the cold mountain air as winter approached. But as the convoy drew closer, something unexpected began to pierce the morning air. A sweet, warm fragrance that seemed utterly incongruous with the mechanical rumble of military vehicles. Akiko, her nose pressed against the glass, was the first to identify it. The smell of baking, rich with cinnamon and butter, carried on the mountain breeze like an impossible dream. In a nation where sugar had become a precious memory and butter existed only in the recollections of the elderly, this aroma seemed to come from another world entirely. The lead vehicle, a massive truck that dwarfed anything the villagers had seen, pulled into the central square of Tsubaki and came to a halt beside the ancient stone well that had served the community for generations. What emerged from these vehicles defied every expectation that months of fearful preparation had created. Instead of the savage conquerors that Japanese propaganda had described, a group of American sailors began unloading equipment with a casual efficiency that spoke of routine rather than conquest. Chief Petty Officer Robert Mack, a barrel-chested man from rural Oregon whose weathered hands spoke of years working his family's apple orchards before the war, supervised the unloading of what appeared to be a complete mobile kitchen. Cast-iron pots large enough to feed hundreds, industrial-sized bags of flour and sugar, crates of canned goods, and most remarkably, several wooden boxes that released the intensifying aroma of fresh apples when opened. The sweet scent that had first puzzled Akiko was indeed what she had suspected. Someone was baking apple pie on an enormous scale, and that someone was wearing the uniform of the United States Navy. Mackenzie's team, 12 sailors from various backgrounds across America began setting up their mobile kitchen with practiced movements that suggested they had performed this same routine many times before. Petty Officer Second Class Antonio Ramirez, whose family had run a small restaurant in San Antonio before he enlisted, started a fire under the largest pot and began preparing what appeared to be enough rice to feed the entire village. Seaman First Class David Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, whose language skills had made him invaluable during the Pacific Campaign, was attempting to communicate with the growing crowd of villagers using a mixture of broken Japanese and expressive hand gestures. The villagers themselves presented a study in confused terror and growing curiosity. Grandmother Sachiko had gathered the women and children behind her like a protective shield, her aged frame trembling with the effort of maintaining her brave facade. The village headman, 60-year-old Takashi Nakamura, approached the Americans with the careful, measured steps of a man walking toward his own execution. His formal bow, deeply respectful despite his obvious fear, was returned by Mackenzie with an awkward but sincere attempt at the same, causing murmurs of surprise among the watching villagers. What followed challenged every assumption the residents of Tsubaki had held about their conquerors. Instead of demands or requisitions, Mackenzie began speaking through Chen's translation in tones that sounded more like invitation than command. The Navy unit, he explained, was part of a humanitarian mission organized by Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, designed to provide emergency food assistance to isolated communities throughout Japan during the difficult transition period following surrender. They had brought enough supplies to feed the entire village for several days, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to share a meal with their former enemies. The concept seemed so alien to everything the villagers had been taught that many initially suspected an elaborate trap. Kenji, the former naval sailor, whispered urgent warnings to his family members. This had to be some form of psychological warfare, he insisted. The Americans would feed them once, gain their trust, then reveal their true intentions. Perhaps the food was poisoned, or perhaps this apparent generosity was designed to make the eventual confiscation of village resources even more devastating. But as the morning progressed and the cooking continued, the evidence of genuine intent became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The quantities of food being prepared exceeded what would be necessary for any kind of deception. Mackenzie's team was cooking enough rice to feed 300 people, despite the village's population of barely 150. They were baking apple pies in Dutch ovens over open fires, using techniques that clearly came from years of experience rather than military training. Most significantly, the Americans were eating the same food they were preparing for the villagers, sharing openly from the same pots and pans. Petty Officer Ramirez, stirring a massive pot of what appeared to be beef stew, noticed young Akiko watching from behind her grandmother's protective embrace. With Chen translating, he called out to her, asking if she would like to help him taste the stew to ensure it was properly seasoned. The offer, extended with the easy friendliness of a man accustomed to cooking for large groups, represented a moment of profound cultural collision. In traditional Japanese society, a young girl would never be invited to participate in cooking alongside adult men, particularly foreign military men. Yet something in Ramirez's manner, his genuine smile, and the casual way he held out a wooden spoon transcended these cultural barriers. Akiko looked to her grandmother for permission, and in that moment, Sachiko faced a decision that would define not just her granddaughter's experience, but the entire village's relationship with their occupiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means everything she had been taught suggested that this invitation was dangerous, potentially the first step in some larger plan to harm or corrupt the child. Yet, watching Ramirez's patient, encouraging expression and seeing the way he interacted with his fellow sailors with easy camaraderie rather than harsh military discipline, she found her convictions wavering. The transformation that began with Sachiko's reluctant nod would ripple through the entire community over the hours that followed. Akiko approached the cooking area with tentative steps, her fear gradually giving way to curiosity as she observed the Americans' cooking techniques. The beef stew contained vegetables she had never seen before, cut with precision and seasoned with herbs that created aromas entirely foreign to traditional Japanese cooking. When Ramirez offered her the spoon to taste, she discovered flavors that seemed to come from an entirely different culinary universe, rich and complex in ways that wartime rationing had made impossible in Japan. More importantly, she discovered that the Americans treated her taste testing with genuine seriousness, asking through Chen's translation whether she thought the stew needed more salt or if the vegetables were cooked properly. They were seeking her opinion, treating a 12-year-old Japanese girl as if her judgment mattered, as if her preferences were worth considering. This simple act of inclusion, so natural to the American sailors that they seemed unaware of its significance, began to crack the foundation of everything the villagers believed about their conquerors. As word spread through the village that the Americans were genuinely cooking for the community, more residents began to venture closer to the central square. The village's other children, emboldened by Akiko's successful interaction, began gathering at the edges of the cooking area. The Americans, rather than treating this attention as an unwelcome intrusion, began engaging with the children directly. Seaman Chen, whose own background had made him sensitive to the challenges of cultural communication, started teaching simple English words for the foods being prepared. Apple became the first English word many of these rural Japanese children learned, repeated with giggles as they pointed to the fruit being prepared for the pies. The apple pies themselves became objects of almost mystical fascination for the villagers. Most had never seen this type of pastry before, with its golden, flaky crust and the sweet, spiced filling that released steam when cut. Mackenzie, whose family's Oregon orchards had provided apples for similar pies throughout his childhood, took obvious pride in demonstrating the baking process. He showed the children how to test the crust for doneness, how to tell when the apples were perfectly tender, and how to achieve the lattice pattern on top that had become his signature technique. The cultural exchange that emerged around these pies revealed the depth of misunderstanding that had separated the two peoples. The villagers had expected crude, unsophisticated occupiers incapable of appreciating the finer aspects of food preparation. Instead, they discovered men who approached cooking with the same attention to detail and pride in craftsmanship that characterized traditional Japanese arts. Mackenzie's careful selection of apples, his precise measurements of spices, and his patient monitoring of baking temperatures demonstrated a dedication to quality that transcended cultural boundaries. As the afternoon approached, the full scope of the Americans' preparation became clear. They had brought enough food to host what could only be described as a feast, with multiple courses representing various American regional cuisines. In addition to the apple pies and beef stew, they had prepared what Ramirez called Southern-style cornbread, Chen's version of California-style rice with vegetables, and Mackenzie's Oregon salmon, grilled over open fires using techniques his grandfather had learned from local Native American tribes. The quantity and variety of food represented a level of abundance that seemed impossible given Japan's current circumstances. While families throughout the nation struggled with severe shortages of even basic necessities, these American sailors were casually preparing a meal that included multiple types of meat, fresh vegetables, dairy products, and refined sugar in quantities that most villagers had not seen since before the war began. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable questions about the relative resources and capabilities of the two nations. Village headman Nakamura, whose responsibilities required him to make decisions on behalf of the entire community, found himself facing an impossible choice. Accepting this apparent generosity might represent collaboration with the enemy, a betrayal of Japanese pride that could have serious consequences if reported to regional authorities. Refusing, however, would mean denying his people access to more food that many had seen in months, potentially condemning some of the village's more vulnerable residents to continued hardship as winter approached. The decision was ultimately made by the village's youngest residents, whose hunger and curiosity proved stronger than their elders' political concerns. As the cooking neared completion and the aromas became increasingly irresistible, the children began gathering more boldly around the American cooking areas. Their presence drew their mothers, who came to supervise but found themselves drawn into conversations with the sailors through Chen's translation and an increasingly elaborate system of hand gestures and shared laughter. What emerged was not the formal, hierarchical interaction that Japanese culture typically required when dealing with foreign authorities, but something much more resembling a neighborhood gathering. Mackenzie found himself surrounded by village women asking detailed questions about his cooking techniques, while Ramirez discovered that several of the older men were accomplished fishermen eager to compare their methods with his family's restaurant experience. The barriers of language, culture, and recent enmity began dissolving in the face of shared interests and mutual curiosity. The moment that would define the entire encounter came when Mackenzie announced that the first of his apple pies was ready to serve. The golden crust had achieved a perfect color he remembered from his mother's kitchen, and the sweet aroma had intensified to the point where even the most suspicious villagers found themselves unconsciously moving closer. With ceremonial solemnity that acknowledged the significance of the moment, he cut the first slice and offered it to grandmother Sachiko, recognizing her as the unofficial leader of the village's resistance to American presence. Sachiko's acceptance of that first slice represented more than a simple decision about food. It symbolized a willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of their conquerors, to allow the possibility that everything they had been taught about American savagery might have been wrong. As she took her first taste of apple pie, her expression shifted from cautious suspicion to obvious surprise, then to something approaching wonder. The combination of sweet apples, warm spices, and buttery crust created flavors that seemed to transport her to an entirely different world, one where such abundance and artistry were possible even in times of hardship. The sight of their respected elder not only accepting but clearly enjoying the American dessert gave the rest of the village permission to overcome their own hesitations. Within minutes, Mackenzie found himself cutting slice after slice, watching with obvious pleasure as villagers experienced their first taste of what many Americans considered a fundamental expression of home and hospitality. Children who had been taught to fear these foreigners were laughing with delight at the sweet flavors, while adults found themselves engaged in animated discussions about ingredients and preparation methods. The transformation that began with that first shared meal would ripple through the village of Tsubaki in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. What started as a simple humanitarian gesture was revealing itself to be something far more complex and significant, challenging assumptions that had been carefully constructed over years of wartime propaganda and cultural isolation. The apple pie that had first announced the Americans' presence with its impossible sweetness was proving to be just the beginning of a much larger revelation about the nature of their former enemies and the possibilities that might emerge from this unexpected encounter. As evening approached and the impromptu feast continued, the villagers found themselves confronting questions that went far beyond simple hunger and hospitality. If these Americans were capable of such generosity toward people they had recently been fighting, what did that suggest about the nature of the conflict that had just ended? If they possessed the resources and organizational capability to provide such abundance even to remote mountain communities, what did that reveal about the relative strength of the two nations? And perhaps most troubling of all, if they were willing to share their food and knowledge so freely with former enemies, what did that say about the propaganda that had portrayed them as barbaric conquerors? These questions would gain urgency and complexity as the American sailors extended their stay in Tsubaki, transforming what had begun as a single meal into a sustained interaction that would challenge every assumption the villagers held about their occupiers and about the war that had brought them together. The next morning brought revelations that would fundamentally alter how the residents of Tsubaki understood their place in the world. Chief Petty Officer Mackenzie had risen before dawn to begin preparing what he called a proper American breakfast, a concept that seemed to defy everything the villagers knew about wartime rationing and resource scarcity. The aroma of frying bacon carried across the mountain air, reaching homes where families had not smelled cooking meat in over 2 years. Akiko's cousin Kenji, the former Imperial Navy sailor who had initially warned of American treachery, found himself drawn to the cooking area despite his continued suspicions.
What he witnessed there challenged every assumption he had formed about enemy capabilities during his military service. The Americans were preparing scrambled eggs using what appeared to be real butter, a commodity that had disappeared from Japanese markets by 1943. They were serving fresh milk with their coffee, something Kenji himself had not tasted since his childhood before the war. The quantities involved defied comprehension. Mackenzie's team was cooking enough eggs to feed every person in the village, plus dozens more. When Kenji asked Petty Officer Chen about this apparent waste, the translator's response left him stunned. These were standard rations for American military personnel, Chen explained. What seemed like impossible abundance to Japanese eyes represented normal portions for U.S. forces. The milk, eggs, and meat that Tsubaki's residents viewed as precious luxuries were considered basic necessities in the American military supply system. This revelation forced Kenji to confront uncomfortable questions about the naval battles he had witnessed. If American sailors were receiving such supplies routinely, what did that suggest about their nation's industrial capacity? During his service aboard the destroyer Hayakaze, his crew had celebrated when they received fresh meat once every 2 weeks. Rice had been supplemented with barley and other grains to stretch limited supplies. Yet here were American sailors casually preparing bacon and eggs as if such ingredients were readily available anywhere in their vast supply network. The mathematical implications became even more disturbing when Mackenzie began explaining his background to curious villagers. His family's Oregon apple orchard, he revealed through Chen's translation, typically produced over 1,500 bushels per year. This single-family farm generated more apples annually than the entire Shimane Prefecture had seen during the previous 3 years of war. When elderly farmer Jiro Tanaka expressed disbelief at these numbers, Mackenzie pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet showing endless rows of apple trees stretching across rolling hills that seemed to continue beyond the horizon. The photograph passed from hand to hand among the villagers, each person studying it with increasing amazement. Farmer Tanaka, who had cultivated his small plot for over 40 years, calculated that Mackenzie's family orchard contained more fruit trees than existed in their entire mountain region. Yet Mackenzie spoke of it as just one ordinary farm among thousands in his state, which was itself just one of 48 American states. The scale of agricultural production these numbers implied seemed to belong to a different world entirely. As the day progressed, the Americans began sharing more details about their civilian backgrounds that painted an increasingly overwhelming picture of material abundance. Petty Officer Ramirez described his family's restaurant in San Antonio, which served over 300 meals per day using ingredients purchased from suppliers who delivered fresh produce, meat, and dairy products twice weekly. Before the war, his father had employed 12 people and had been planning to open a second location, treating business expansion as a routine possibility rather than an impossible dream. Seaman First Class Michael O'Brien, a farm boy from Iowa whose weathered hand spoke of years working grain fields, explained that his family's wheat farm covered sections of land measured in thousands of acres, rather than the small plots familiar to Japanese farmers. Their mechanical harvesters could process more grain in a single day than Tsubaki's farmers could manage in an entire season working by hand. The concept of mechanized agriculture on such a scale existed beyond the experience or imagination of villagers whose farming methods had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. These personal accounts created a growing sense of vertigo among the listening villagers as they attempted to reconcile such descriptions with their understanding of the world. If individual American families possessed resources that exceeded entire Japanese communities, what did that suggest about the relative capabilities of the two nations? How could Japan have believed it could prevail in a war against such abundance? The most profound shock came when the Americans began casually discarding food that would have been precious in Japan. Seaman O'Brien, finishing his breakfast, scraped the remaining eggs from his plate into a container designated for waste. When young Akiko's eyes widened at this apparent squandering, he noticed her reaction and attempted to explain through gestures and Chen's translation that the food would be composted rather than simply thrown away. But the sight of edible protein being discarded, even for productive purposes, represented a level of abundance that seemed almost insulting to people who had carefully saved every grain of rice for months. Mackenzie, observing the villagers' reactions to their casual food practices, began to understand the cultural chasm his team had unknowingly revealed. That afternoon, he gathered several of the village's senior men and attempted to explain American agricultural and industrial systems in terms they might comprehend. Using drawings in the dirt and Chen's patient translation, he described factory farms where single operations might raise thousands of cattle, processing plants that could handle entire herds in a single day, and transportation networks that moved fresh food across distances greater than the length of all Japanese islands combined. The numbers Mackenzie cited seemed to belong to science fiction rather than reality. American steel production in 1944 had exceeded 80 million tons, more than 10 times Japan's peak output. A single American automotive plant could produce more vehicles in a month than Japan manufactured in an entire year. The Liberty ships that had transported supplies across the Pacific were being built at a rate of 3 per day, using mass production techniques that treated enormous ocean-going vessels as if they were automobiles rolling off an assembly line. Village headman Nakamura, whose responsibilities required him to understand the implications of such information, found these revelations deeply disturbing. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda had emphasized American moral weakness and industrial inefficiency, claiming that democratic societies lacked the discipline necessary for sustained wartime production. The evidence before him suggested the opposite was true. American industrial capacity appeared to dwarf Japan's not despite their democratic system, but perhaps because of it. The Americans' casual attitude toward their abundant supplies began to make sense within this larger context. Mackenzie's team could afford to be generous with their food because they represented a military force supplied by an industrial system that produced vast surpluses as a matter of routine. What seemed like impossible generosity to Japanese eyes was actually standard operating procedure for forces accustomed to material abundance on an unprecedented scale. This realization prompted village elder Sachiko to ask pointed questions about American society through Chen's translation. How did ordinary families afford such abundance? What enabled farmers like Mackenzie's parents to own such vast orchards? Were these sailors representative of typical Americans, or did they come from particularly wealthy families? The answers proved even more unsettling than the questions themselves. Mackenzie, O'Brien, and Ramirez represented what they described as middle-class American families, neither wealthy nor poor by their nation's standards. Mackenzie's father had purchased the Oregon orchard through a bank loan, a financial instrument that made land ownership accessible to working families. Ramirez's parents had immigrated from Mexico with minimal resources, but had built their restaurant business through a combination of hard work and access to credit systems that supported small business development. Seaman First Class Michael O'Brien, a farm boy from Iowa whose weathered hands spoke of years working grain fields, explained that his family's wheat farm covered sections of land measured in thousands of acres, rather than the small plots familiar to Japanese farmers. Their mechanical harvesters could process more grain in a single day than Tsubaki's farmers could manage in an entire season working by hand. The concept of mechanized agriculture on such a scale existed beyond the experience or imagination of villagers whose farming methods had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. These personal accounts created a growing sense of vertigo among the listening villagers as they attempted to reconcile such descriptions with their understanding of the world. If individual American families possessed resources that exceeded entire Japanese communities, what did that suggest about the relative capabilities of the two nations? How could Japan have believed it could prevail in a war against such abundance? The most profound shock came when the Americans began casually discarding food that would have been precious in Japan. Seaman O'Brien, finishing his breakfast, scraped the remaining eggs from his plate into a container designated for waste. When young Akiko's eyes widened at this apparent squandering, he noticed her reaction and attempted to explain through gestures and Chen's translation that the food would be composted rather than simply thrown away. But the sight of edible protein being discarded, even for productive purposes, represented a level of abundance that seemed almost insulting to people who had carefully saved every grain of rice for months. Mackenzie, observing the villagers' reactions to their casual food practices, began to understand the cultural chasm his team had unknowingly revealed. That afternoon, he gathered several of the village's senior men and attempted to explain American agricultural and industrial systems in terms they might comprehend. Using drawings in the dirt and Chen's patient translation, he described factory farms where single operations might raise thousands of cattle, processing plants that could handle entire herds in a single day, and transportation networks that moved fresh food across distances greater than the length of all Japanese islands combined. The numbers Mackenzie cited seemed to belong to science fiction rather than reality. American steel production in 1944 had exceeded 80 million tons, more than 10 times Japan's peak output. A single American automotive plant could produce more vehicles in a month than Japan manufactured in a month.
O'Brien's family farm had been homesteaded by his grandfather, who had received the land through government programs designed to encourage agricultural development. These personal histories revealed economic and social systems that seemed fundamentally different from anything the villagers had experienced. The concept that ordinary working families could own substantial amounts of land, operate their own businesses, or access credit for expansion represented possibilities that existed far outside traditional Japanese social structures. Even more remarkable was the suggestion that such opportunities were considered normal rather than exceptional in American society. The implications extended beyond economics to questions of social organization and individual opportunity. When Sachiko asked whether these men had been required to seek permission from local authorities to pursue their various enterprises, the Americans seemed genuinely confused by the question. Mackenzie's father had decided to plant apple trees based on his own assessment of market opportunities. Ramirez's family had opened their restaurant when they determined the location would be profitable. O'Brien's grandfather had chosen his farmland simply by claiming it under homestead laws. The idea that individual families could make such decisions independently without seeking approval from traditional authorities represented a form of social freedom that seemed almost anarchic to villagers raised in hierarchical Japanese society. As these conversations continued throughout the second day, the villagers began to comprehend that they were encountering representatives of a social and economic system that operated according to principles fundamentally different from their own. The abundance they witnessed was not simply a matter of natural resources or temporary wartime mobilization, but the product of sustained industrial and social development that had been proceeding for decades along paths that Japan had not pursued. The Americans' technical knowledge provided another dimension of this revelation. When the village's water pump began malfunctioning, Seaman O'Brien examined the mechanism and quickly identified the problem as a worn gasket that was allowing pressure to escape. Using tools from his military kit and improvised materials, he fabricated a replacement that restored the pump to full function within an hour. The casual competence with which he approached this repair, treating it as a routine maintenance task rather than a complex technical challenge, impressed villagers who had been preparing to send someone on a 2-day journey to the nearest town for professional assistance. O'Brien's mechanical skills, he explained, came from years of maintaining farm equipment in Iowa, where individual farmers were expected to handle most repairs themselves rather than relying on specialized technicians. The tools he carried in his military kit were similar to those found in most American farm workshops, representing a level of technical sophistication that enabled individual operators to maintain complex machinery independently. This decentralized technical capability, multiplied across millions of American farms and businesses, created a foundation of practical knowledge that supported their nation's industrial development. The educational backgrounds of the American sailors revealed yet another aspect of the systems that had produced such abundance. Mackenzie had completed what he called high school, 12 years of formal education that included mathematics, science, and practical arts. This level of schooling, he indicated, was considered normal for American young people regardless of their family's economic status. Public education through the secondary level was provided free of charge by local communities, supported by tax systems that funded schools as a community investment in future capability. Ramirez had attended a technical school after completing his basic education, learning restaurant management and commercial food preparation through programs designed to prepare students for specific careers.
The concept that communities would invest public resources in training young people for various trades and professions without requiring them to find individual masters or apprenticeships represented an approach to human development that maximized the utilization of available talent. Even O'Brien, whose background was primarily agricultural, had received education in mechanical principles, basic chemistry, and agricultural science through programs operated by his state's university system. Extension agents visited farming communities regularly, sharing new techniques and scientific developments that helped individual farmers improve their productivity. This systematic application of scientific knowledge to agricultural practice had enabled American farms to achieve yields per acre that far exceeded what traditional methods could produce. These educational systems created workforce capabilities that supported the industrial abundance the villagers had witnessed. Workers who understood mechanical principles could maintain and improve complex machinery. Farmers who applied scientific methods could maximize their land's productivity. Business operators who had studied management techniques could organize efficient enterprises. The casual competence displayed by Mackenzie's team reflected educational investments that had been accumulating across American society for generations. The social implications of such educational access disturbed some of the village's traditional leaders. If ordinary people possessed technical knowledge and decision-making capabilities, what role remained for traditional authorities? How could social order be maintained if individuals were encouraged to think independently and pursue their own economic interests? The American system seemed to depend on trusting ordinary people with responsibilities that Japanese society reserved for established elites. Yet the evidence suggested that such trust produced results. The abundance, technical capability, and organizational efficiency the villagers had witnessed emerged from systems that encouraged individual initiative while providing support for collective goals. The American military even reflected these principles, with junior personnel like Mackenzie's team empowered to make decisions and take actions that would require senior approval in more hierarchical organizations. As the third day of the American stay approached, village discussions began focusing on the long-term implications of these revelations. If American society possessed such advantages in industrial capacity, educational development, and social organization, what did that suggest about Japan's future prospects? Could their nation learn from American methods while preserving essential aspects of Japanese culture? Or would adopting such approaches require fundamental changes to traditional social structures? These questions gained urgency as news arrived from the outside world through the Americans' radio communications. General MacArthur's occupation forces were beginning to implement reforms throughout Japan, introducing changes to political, economic, and educational systems based on American models. The transformation that Tobaki had experienced in microcosm over 3 days was about to unfold across the entire nation over the coming years. The village found itself in the unique position of having direct, personal experience with the American approaches that would soon become official policy. Mackenzie's team had provided a preview of the values, methods, and capabilities that would guide Japan's reconstruction. Rather than encountering these changes as imposed reforms, Tubaki's residents would recognize them as extensions of the generosity, technical competence, and social cooperation they had witnessed firsthand. The personal relationships that had developed between individual villagers and American sailors created emotional foundations for broader cultural understanding. When Akiko successfully taught Mackenzie several Japanese words for cooking terms, or when farmer Tanaka and O'Brien collaborated on repairing a damaged irrigation channel, they were building bridges that transcended the political and military conflicts that had divided their nations. These human connections would prove more powerful than any official policy in changing attitudes toward the occupation and reconstruction process. The villagers had experienced American character and capabilities through direct personal interaction rather than through propaganda. Ordinary generosity expressed through shared meals, American technical competence demonstrated through practical assistance, and American social values reflected in the respectful treatment they had received despite being former enemies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.